thank you very much, Paul, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. I'm delighted to be here at the Institute of Physics Frontiers of Physics Day in Waterford. I haven't been at very many of these. I think the last one I was at was in Cork, which is where I'm from, in UCC, and I think that would have been 2013 or 2014 maybe, Paul, when I was reasonably new to this job. I am what's called an Examinations and Assessment Manager with the State Examinations Commission. And two of my roles are to act as Chief Examiner for Science and Chief Examiner for Physics, meaning that my responsibilities include developing the test instruments, the question papers, and managing the marking of those. Prior to that, so I joined the SEC in January 2013. Prior to that, for 9.5 years, I was a secondary school teacher in a voluntary secondary school in Cork. Prior to that, I was working in third level as a postdoctoral researcher and as a PhD student. And my field was what's called computational quantum chemistry. So I am not a physicist. I am a chemist. But I think I'm even the other computational quantum chemists used to think I was really more like a physicist in terms of the work I was doing. And computational quantum chemistry is molecular physics. It's the same thing. That's what it is. But I didn't really like it. I was an unhappy researcher because I found it very isolating, because it was essentially me communicating with a computer all the time, and perhaps not very effectively. I much preferred being a secondary school teacher, but I also really enjoy my role now. I'm also, for a number of years, I was the Chief Examiner for Applied Mathematics, and I've recently learned that I am again the Chief Examiner for Applied Mathematics, so that's another piece of work that I'll be doing. But today, that was the original title of this presentation, what makes a good exam question. And before I go into details, what I would say are two things, what makes a good exam question. First of all, from a secondary school teacher's perspective, what makes a good exam question is one that can be recycled, one that can be tweaked and reused. And in that context, this whole speech is a recycled one. And a number of you who were at the ISTA weekend on the Sunday morning, I spoke with a very, very similar presentation. If you wish to leave now, you may do so. It won't be significantly different. There will be a few tweaks. So recyclability is something that struck me. But really what makes a good exam question is regular editing, okay? And in the modern world, the way we work, we never really begin with a blank document, do we? We begin with a Word document or something like that. That's a previous iteration. And so it's all about not writing, it's really about editing. And so again, in that context, I'm editing the title, a less aggressive all caps font, perhaps, proper words like examination, and crucially, the removal of the question mark. I'm not asking you what makes a good examination question. I'm hopefully telling you what makes a good examination paper, because the relationship between questions and papers is very important. You could have a great question, but it's only one question. The paper is ultimately the product that the students have to engage with. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my organization, the SEC. I'm going to talk to you about our assessment principles. What are our principles when we design a test instrument, an examination paper, and then I'm going to talk to you about some of the details of writing papers and writing questions. I'm going to talk to you about marking schemes, and I'm then going to, at the end, hopefully talk to you a little bit about some current developments in senior cycle physics. I'm happy to take questions during my speech. I'm happy to take questions afterwards as time allows, or I'm happy to have a chat with people. I'll be around certainly for most of the day, I hope. And I would welcome the opportunity to chat with people. Something else about my background: when I was a secondary school teacher, every summer I worked as an examiner for Junior Cert Science for 2 years, and then for Leaving Cert Ordinary Level Physics for 1 year, and then Leaving Cert Higher Level Physics for a number of years as an examiner. And it is and it was the greatest experience, okay? And I know some people here are involved in exam work, in marking scripts. If you're not, you should be, okay? It is the best professional development, and it is a wonderful insight into young people's answers to questions. If you've marked 300 answers to a particular question, you have seen the sorts of confusion that young people have about topics, and you will go back into your own class in September knowing that those people in front of you probably have similar kinds of confusion. So reading the right answer all the time doesn't teach you all that much. Reading a blank answer all the time doesn't teach you that much. But reading the sorts of ambiguous, weird, confusing answers tells you that's how 15-year-olds or 18-year-olds are thinking. So that's how my class, some of them are thinking. And it is, in that sense, a wonderful experience. Now, the SEC is one of 3 organizations that apparently work together developing some procedures for second level education. I often put up this slide. I pretty much put up this slide every time I give a talk of this sort. And I always make the same joke, so I'm going to make it again, that those of you who have a technical mind, which is all of you, will notice that the SEC is turning so as to oppose the collective efforts of the NCCA and the DES. I did not make this slide. Whoever did either did this deliberately to sort of undermine everything or accidentally perhaps. But I'm not saying that that's true, but I think it's interesting. So what does the SEC do? So we provide a service, which is an examination service, to about 120,000 candidates every year between junior cert and now junior cycle. Leaving cert applied. Because you're all physicists, I know that you can handle what chemists can't handle, which is scientific notation. So that's how many components and how many results we issue. So there is an awful lot of work happening, and people mark those components. People mark those items. And that's what we do. Some people don't like exams, and that's a shame because they're not going away. Some people don't like that. What does the SEC do? We measure people and we label them accordingly. So we have our 2 young people there. Our job is to slap a grade on you, okay? For gender reasons, I had to give the young lady a higher grade. So that's what we do. So if you don't like the idea of measuring people, well, you've been measured from before you were born, and you will be measured again. And between those 2 times, you are regularly measured. I suppose the important thing is who's doing the measuring, how are they doing the measuring, and probably most of all, for what purpose are they using the measurements, okay? And for you as teachers, there are many answers to that, okay? We talk about summative assessment, informative assessment, and so on, but you want to think about who's doing the measuring, how are they doing the measuring, and then what purpose is being put to the measurement. And essentially the SEC, our purpose is just to generate grades. Other people use those grades. The CAO, which is really, I was talking to some of you last night about this, the CAO is really a 3rd level organization. The CAO use our grades to generate points and offers for places, not the SEC, not the Department of Education. So the assessment principles that the SEC has, and I'll talk to you about each of these, are those 6. And of those 6, the first 2, validity and reliability, are the most important, I would say, and the most technical that we'll try to tease out. So I will, in due course, be talking to you, quite a degree more about physics and about science. But initially, for this part of the talk, it is more a generic discussion of these assessment principles. Validity refers to the accuracy with which an examination paper measures what it's trying to measure, okay? And what I'm trying to measure when we develop a physics question paper is we are trying to measure your ability as outlined in the Department of Education physics syllabus. and that is the current syllabus, which has been examined since 2002. So the purpose of the exam is to measure how well students have fulfilled the objectives of the syllabus. Syllabi are no longer going to be called syllabi. The NCCA has decided that they're going to be called specifications. It doesn't really matter, okay? So within the specification or the syllabus, there is knowledge or content, okay? And there are also skills. So we need to make sure that we are measuring those things. I can't just say, well, I'd like if they were able to do this. If it's not on the syllabus, I can't ask it, okay? And it would be, as you would imagine, highly controversial if something was asked that wasn't clearly on the syllabus or specification. Reliability then refers to the consistency of the results produced by an examination, i.e. how confident we can be that the mark won't change if we change some supposedly incidental features of the examination. So if we had a different question paper and therefore we're testing a different sample of the syllabus content, would that lead to a significantly different mark or grade? I think we all know it would lead to a slightly different mark, but we would hope that a student who is a H3 would not suddenly be getting a H8 because it was a different paper, okay? Even within a paper, there are many papers in that, let's say in the current physics paper, students are meant to choose 8 out of 12 questions, and there are other sort of rubrics as well regarding internal choice and 3 out of the first 4 and so on. So there is more than one way of doing the paper. It's a combinatorics problem, but there are many ways of doing the paper. Would that make a difference to your mark? Presumably it would. Presumably students choose the ones that they think they're going to do best in. If it was marked by a different person, we call the people who mark work, we call them examiners. They examine the work. They do not correct the work. And those of you who know me will know that I get very cross at people who talk about, oh, I'm correcting for the summer. No, you're not. You're not. You're marking or you're examining. We do not correct the work, as in we do not edit it to make it correct. We simply mark it. So teasing out about validity and reliability again. Validity is to what extent are we measuring the right thing, and then reliability is how consistently are we measuring the thing we are measuring. So to give you an example, a coach is asked to rank people according to their ability to play basketball. So he has a group of people and he wants to put them in order of how good you are at playing basketball. So how does he test your ability to play basketball? This coach decides to measure the people's heights using a tape measure. That's how he does it. Now, the question is that a reliable test? Is it a valid test? It's a highly reliable test. We would expect that if a different coach with a different tape measure made the measurements, he would get pretty much the same numbers, okay? He would get the same heights to the nearest centimeter or so. Is it a valid test? Not really. It's not without some validity, okay? I myself am not very tall, and that correlates to my ability on the basketball court, okay? But we know that height is not really a valid test for ability to play basketball. So that's the dynamic between reliability and validity. It's no good having a highly reliable test if you're measuring the wrong thing, okay? So reliability is intrinsic to the measurement, but validity is all about the purpose, okay? Is this a valid test for measuring how tall you are? Absolutely. Is it a valid test for measuring how good you are playing basketball? Not at all, okay? Or not very much. Some of the other assessment principles reasonably quickly. So we want examination questions, examination papers to be free from bias, i.e. a characteristic that would lead to different level of achievement by different groups, okay? So we need to be careful with things like language and contexts and examples and even diagrams and illustrations. Are they possibly more meaningful to one group of candidates than another? However, different levels of performance by different groups, like girls and boys, does not mean that the test instrument was biased, okay? So if girls do better on an exam paper, it doesn't mean that it was biased towards girls. There might be many sociological and biological reasons why that might be. Inclusiveness and equity. Examination papers should reflect an inclusive view of society, no inappropriate stereotyping, and balance in relation to such matters as gender, religion, culture, Gender is the big one that really I'm talking about here, and I'm going to talk a little bit at the end of my talk about gender. And obviously in physics, there is, and has been for generations, there is a problem with getting women into physics. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about it right now, but it's definitely something that is important to all of us. Discrimination sounds like a bad thing, and in this context of assessment, it's not a bad thing. We want papers to discriminate. We want them to split the people into different grades. We need to be able to distinguish between candidates. There is no real purpose to an examination if it doesn't split them. Okay, so we need to make sure that the question paper and the marking of it leads to a spread of grades across the available range. So a question or a paper that everyone gets right really has no purpose. And a question that everyone gets wrong has no purpose as well. It doesn't discriminate between people, okay? Did I go back there? Yeah. So the exam paper should allow for differentiation of performance among the candidature. So many of these things really, I'm going to go through these pretty quickly because they're not really all that hugely relevant if you're making an exam paper for your class. But it's one of the principles of the SEC, accessibility. We want our exam papers to be accessible to everybody. So our exam papers are produced in 2 languages, English and Irish. But we also provide for candidates who have difficulty accessing standard examination papers. So we allow for enlarged papers, Braille papers, and also obviously things like accommodations like readers, scribes, those sorts of things, okay? So that there are no barriers to taking the paper. Now, so I'm going to move on to talk about when the SEC works to develop papers. We don't just develop the examination paper. We have what we call an integrated approach where we look at 3 things and they all feed into each other. The examination paper as it's developing, a draft marking scheme. So you can't write an examination paper and say, oh, we'll worry about the marking scheme in June. You have to have it reasonably well developed before they ever sit the paper, because the marking scheme, in writing a marking scheme, it tells you, am I really asking the right thing? Or should I be asking in a different way? And we also produce something called an assessment grid. An assessment grid, if I show you an example of one in a moment, it'll make sense. It's basically your checklist that am I asking things, is everything on the syllabus that I'm asking? And then am I asking things across the range of cognitive ability? So I don't want to be just stuck in one cognitive domain, like recalling things. I want to have questions depending on the type of examination paper and the type of cohort that you're trying to examine. Do I have questions that go into some of the higher order cognitive domains? So as we are developing papers, as we are writing papers, we constantly work on the assessment grid to sort of check that we're asking the right things, and we constantly work on the marking scheme to check that there is sort of one answer or a small number of unambiguous answers. Okay, so an assessment grid looks like something like that. That's just a fake one for a fake question 11 on a junior science paper. But you look at the different cognitive domains, and then the sort of items here, that's like physical world 3, nature of science 4. Those are the names of some of the learning outcomes in the new junior cycle science specification, to call it its correct name. So that's what an assessment grid looks like. Would you be producing something like that if you were writing your Christmas test? Yes, you probably would, but it would be in your mind. Okay, it mightn't necessarily be on paper because we're all busy people. But you would be checking, I don't want to just ask about those 3 learning outcomes when there are 100 learning outcomes that they're meant to know. Okay? And I don't want everything to be just name this, name this, name this. I want to give them some other things to do. Am I giving them calculations? Am I giving them things with diagrams? Am I asking things in a varied sort of way? So, questions. The first thing is that we can divide all questions into 2 types, what we call selected response and constructed response. Selected response is where we give them the answers in a range of answers. So typically things like multiple choice, okay? Constructed response is where they have to come up with the answer themselves. They can be short items where the constructed answer is read. They can be essay type things, drawing diagrams, things like that, depending on the subject and the exam paper. So selected response could be true, false. It could be item matching. The advantages is that they can be marked generally very, very accurately and reliably. In some jurisdictions, but not yet in Ireland, questions like this can be machine marked, or certainly they can be marked by non-subject specialists. Meaning that if you tell them, is it A, B, C, or D, and the correct answer is C, you don't have to be a physics teacher to know C gets the mark. A, B, or D, or blank doesn't get the mark, okay? Potentially, someone in a different country who doesn't speak English and who works for a very small fee could do that, okay? Right, this is slightly sinister now. We don't do that at the moment. Okay? We did this year, and many of you know about this, for a number of subjects, including junior science and Leaving Cert Physics, we moved to what's called online marking, whereby the examiner, working at home, instead of looking at a candidate's response on paper, was looking at a scanned image of the candidate response, and instead of writing a tick or a number, was entering those electronically. And it was a tremendous success, and again, I'm happy to talk to some of you about that if you wish, but a number of you were involved in that initiative this year, and that's something that will be continuing and spreading out to pretty much every subject in the next few years, is online on-screen marking. A week or two before the Leaving Cert, one of the popular newspapers had a headline that the computer was going to be marking the Leaving Cert, and we quickly pointed out that no, they were going to be marked on computer, not by computer, okay? So the move to machine marking hasn't happened yet, but I'm all in favor of it. I mean, less having to deal with people who are difficult, to say the least. You know who you are, people I'm talking about. But these selected response questions, students do them quickly. Examiners can mark them quickly, and because they can be done quickly by the candidate, you can ask more questions, okay, allowing a broader range of course coverage. But there are significant disadvantages, okay? Obviously, they can be guessing. You can have sort of scales and weightings and negative marks to mean that if someone just guessed at random, they should end up with 0, that you sort of take away a quarter for every wrong answer, and you have 1 for every right answer, that style of thing, if you wish. They can be quite difficult to design. They are more difficult to design than first appears. And certainly we would have concerns that if all we were doing were these selected response questions, there would be a strong negative backwash effect into what happens in classrooms, okay? Because typically they usually, but not always, they end up asking some of the lower order skills, just the recall, the knowledge, which has a place, but you know, only as part of an examination rather than the whole examination. Constructed response, as I said, can be anything else where you're not giving them the options, okay? Obviously then they can't be guessing, and it is easier to test some higher order skills. So a calculation, a diagram, a paragraph, an explanation, that sort of thing is more typically going to interrogate some higher order skills. However, the marking of it will not be as reliable. And we have done, I've done some research on what's called inter-rater reliability, inter-examiner reliability. If you gave 2 examiners the same piece of work, how likely is it that the mark that they generate will be the same or very close to each other? And so we know that that's slightly different for different subjects and different types of examinations. But certainly constructed response, like essays, we can't really say that we know that these are being marked with absolute reliability, with absolute consistency. And because they're certainly some of these longer questions, they take more time for the student, so it's then harder for us to ask a wide range of material on the question paper. One of the problems with constructed response questions is that there can be ambiguity or misinterpretation. So here's a question, not from physics. This was a question in an exam. What's the underlined word in the sentence below? A famous author is visiting my school next week, and school is underlined. So you're not given any selection. You don't know, well, what are they asking me here? What's the underlined word? The underlined word is school. Is that what I'm saying? Or is it the 6th word? Or what is it exactly I'm meant to do? There's misinterpretation possible, there's ambiguity. If you give it like that, now you know exactly what the question is, and the answer, I think, is a noun, I think, okay? So it doesn't mean that the question has become necessarily easier. It might, but it certainly, hopefully, means the question has become clearer. Now I know what I was trying to ask, okay? Now, some other issues when writing questions, we want them to be readable. So the format and layout of the paper is important. When I was teaching, I always enjoyed and took pride in preparing exams and typed them, obviously, and had them on computer. One, because it made for a better format and readability for the students, but also because then the issue of recyclability. It was then stored so that for the next year I could take it, tweak it a little bit if the class was a slightly different type of class, or maybe not tweak it much at all. Some colleagues of mine were still doing handwritten papers, and I found it troubling, A, because it meant every year they had to go and sort of rewrite it again if they wanted to change it, and B, I don't think it looks good. I think if we expect a high degree of good presentation from our students, then we should give them something with a high degree of presentation as well. Diagrams are very, very important, increasingly important. Those of you who looked at the new junior cycle science examination, which was the new specification was examined for the first time this year, you will have noted that there is colour diagrams, and that's something I think that's good. The world is colourful, so question papers should as well. There are some issues surrounding colour that aren't there with the grayscale papers, but either way, diagrams can be very, very important. The other issue with readability is that we want language that's very, very clear, precise, and intelligible, given that we know that we're not writing questions for adults, and in some cases we're writing questions for 15-year-olds, and some of those will be very weak 15-year-olds. Some of those will not be accessing the examination in their first language. English may not be their first language, okay? But at the same time, we need to ask things. We can't just make it very, simple sentences all the time. We have to get to the heart of what they know. So visual resources are important, and really, I would say that there are three types of illustrations or diagrams. Ones that are decorative. All these three examples are going to be taken from this year's ordinary level physics paper. So we had a question about stretched string, frequency on a stretched string, and the diagram illustration next to the question was a picture of Spock playing a guitar. It didn't generate any of the comment that I kind of thought it would. I don't think kids knew who that was, okay? So, whereas 3 or 4 years ago on the higher level physics paper, on a similar question about frequency of stretched strings, we had a picture of a young man called Ed Sheeran, and my God, they went crazy, okay? It blew up the internet, or whatever they say, okay? But the point is that really the question functions just as well without the diagram. So is there a purpose to the diagram? It breaks things up, it makes things look more attractive. When you open the paper and you're nervous on the morning of the exam, it's nice to see something other than just text, text, text. It's nice to have things broken up. Sometimes then diagrams are more important, and they can point out, like, so again, on this year's ordinary level paper, we had a question about the resistance of a wire, and we had to refer to the diameter and ask them to calculate the cross-sectional area. So we put up that diagram to show them, this was ordinary level physics, to show them what we meant by circular cross-sectional area, okay? So the phrase was in the body of the text, but also then in the diagram. So it's a related illustration that certainly we hope would help make the question more accessible. And then there are illustrations that are essential because they give them information that is not in the text. And that would be typical in physics, where we're giving data, we're giving numbers, like we were here in a equilibrium question, okay? Now, so again, some generic things, and some of this I'm going to go through again quite quickly, because it's not just to do with physics, it's to do with all types of exam papers. We try to use short, simple sentences and avoid unnecessary clauses. So there's an example of a question that might have been on something like a geography paper, and if you read that, you'll very quickly, when you get to the end of it, realize I'm not quite sure exactly what it was I was being asked, okay? Because it's a very long, multi-clause sentence. You'd be much better off breaking it up into a number of short sentences, okay? So that's something that's really, really important. And that, when does that happen? That happens in the editing. You write the first version because you know what you want to write, and then you come back to it, the next day or the next week, and you read it and you say, no, I need to split that sentence into 2 or 3 or 4, okay? I'm not sure that I necessarily agree with this in this instance. I'm not sure that the first version of that question has any real problems. Find the area of a rectangle of length 7 centimeters and width 3 centimeters. That seems to me pretty okay. But you could break it up if you wanted. You could give the information and then follow it up with the question, find its area, to keep the question separate from everything else, okay? Certainly if that question was any more complicated, find its area and also its perimeter and also do this for a triangle, then certainly you want to give the information and then at the end say, now go and do this and this and this. So separating things. Eliminate superfluous words. Any word that isn't really, doing something shouldn't be there, okay? It's not a prose competition. It's simply, I am trying to get my mind into your mind. I'm trying to explain what it is I want you to do. Double negatives and things like that are extremely frustrating for students and often lead to mistakes. So something like that, Tom's mother was anything but pleased. Again, for people who struggle with language or for whom English is not their first language, that could be extremely confusing and potentially ambiguous. So we always try to improve. Use the correct command words, okay? So these are the type of command words that might be on a science or a physics paper, okay? And so it's always, you always need to think about exactly what is it I'm asking them to do. And I certainly don't like command words like give or find because they're a little bit too ambiguous. Give me an example of something. No, state an example. Name an example. Describe an example. But what does give really mean? I don't like it. So the meaning of the command word is central to the meaning of the question. Command words may be also used as what syllabus developers call action verbs, but we're not talking about in that context here. We're just talking about a word in an examination paper that's telling a student what to do. The meaning of command words, even though we kind of think we all know what describe or explain means, sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to narrow it down exactly what it is we're trying to say. And sometimes we end up using higher level command words unnecessarily because we're afraid of questions like name or state, okay? Because it sounds like it's very low order. We want it to be describe and explain and so on. And so you can end up with things like that. Describe one feature that both these animals have. This is from an exam paper in a different jurisdiction. Describe is not really the right command word there. You're just asking them to name it, okay? Now, emphasis and putting things in bold is useful and important, but only if used sparingly, okay? So things like negative words, perhaps numbers, other words that might be overlooked, but there is nothing worse than that sort of thing, overuse of bold. And certainly when I inherited one of the papers that I'm now responsible for, it had an awful lot of bold in it that really was very confusing for students. When each sentence has 3 or 4 words in bold, give up. Put the whole thing in unbold, I would say, at that point, okay? And then you had combinations of bold, underlined, italics, and so on. So I thought at this point you're going to be very, very frustrated. I'm surprised that you're even all still here. Maybe some of you have left when I wasn't looking. But I thought I better put up some physics so that we can sort of get into that mode of thinking. So I said I just picked some of my personal favorite questions, okay? And this was one of them. This is not my all-time favorite. These are all from higher level physics for the last few years. But I liked this question a lot. And this question came from when I was teaching. I was teaching my last year teaching. I was teaching a very, very good group, 17 boys. It was a boys' school where I was working. And 16 of them were also doing chemistry. I wasn't teaching them chemistry. Sometimes I taught chemistry, sometimes I taught physics, sometimes I taught maths and applied maths. But this group I had for physics, most of them were doing chemistry. And they asked me, there was a poster at the back of the room and they said, why is it blue? What does it mean? And you could give them the answer because, there's some dye or chemical in it that is blue. But that wasn't really what they were asking. And ultimately what I ended up explaining to them was that the white light, which they knew was a mixture of all the different colors, that some of the frequencies, some of the colors are absorbed by the blue poster, but then some are reflected. And the ones that are reflected are blue. The red and the green and other colors are absorbed. And they completely understood that because, as I say, essentially because they were doing chemistry as well. So that's enough about chemistry. So a few years later then, when I was developing the paper, this was the kind of question I wanted to ask. Can you explain why a book looks red? What would it look like if you were shining green light on it? Okay? What would it look like if you were shining, something else on it? So I enjoyed that question. This, I think, was my favorite question ever, and they did very poorly in it because it's so far away from rote learning. It's something else. It's the last part of it, really. So they had to draw or describe with aid of a label diagram how a depletion layer is formed and say what a depletion layer was, and then on their diagram they had to put in what sections were positively charged, what sections were negatively charged, and what sections were neutral. And they all thought, if I take a p-type, most of them knew that a diode is p-type and n-type, and then something happens in the middle, there's some movement of electrons or holes. But they all thought a p-type is positive. It's not, it's neutral. An n-type is not negative, it's neutral. It has the same number of protons and electrons, okay? But they thought this was positive, this was negative, and when they join, it'll be neutral in the middle. Whereas, of course, it's very much not that, okay? So we all know that even terminal examinations like the Leaving Cert have a second function. Obviously, their main function is to assess those students. Did they have this knowledge? Did they have this ability to explain that? But there is a secondary effect as well, and this is intended. I wanted everyone in the whole country to know how to do this, and so I hope this was on the Christmas test of most schools the next year. Maybe it will be this year, okay? Because I thought it was a good question. Questions with diagrams are increasingly important, and junior science has for many years been what we call a completion booklet, meaning you write your answers. Maths exams are like that as well. You write your answer in the question paper. And one of the things about that is that you have a better way of asking them to edit or complete diagrams. Whereas with a paper where they write on a separate answer book, they have to sort of draw what you give them and then do something with it. But it was still a question that I think was important. They all know about refraction, but can they show the sort of two refractions at the two curved faces at the top of a lens, okay? And certainly we found that they did not do very well in that. And I sound like I'm taking pleasure in things that, when students can't do, and that's correct. That is, basically speaking, I do take pleasure in that. No, the point is obviously these are three reasonably hard questions, and that's probably why they're favorites. But you have to mix things up. You can't just have questions like this, because if you do, you'll have a horrible summer if you're me, because you won't be getting the right grades. And we have to be fair, not just to this year's candidates, but to every year's candidates. And it wouldn't be fair if this year the paper was so much harder than previous years. Because you might have someone who did their Leaving Cert in 2008 competing for entry to third level with someone who did their Leaving Cert in 2009. How do we make sure that the papers are of the same level? Obviously, we designed the papers so that we think, oh, it's a bit too hard or it's a bit too easy. But you can't get that perfect. It's only when you start looking at results and you realize, oh no, we don't have enough H1s, they're significantly down from previous years, then you tweak the marking scheme. And that's something that we do during the process of marking. When we've marked about 5 or 6% of the work, we look at the statistics, and if necessary, we adjust the marking scheme. And those of you who have marked know all about that, and that's when the real fun happens. So, marking schemes. Marking schemes have to be considered when you're developing the paper, when you're first starting on the paper. But then marking scheme changes, as I was just describing. It changes during the marking when you realize the paper was too easy or the paper was too hard and we're not getting the right statistics. But it's no good writing a paper unless you know that it can be marked, okay? That there is a range, hopefully a reasonably short range of responses that will get marks, okay? So consider the response that you're getting. Sometimes you start with that. Okay, I want them to know this, so I want them to give me that answer. Okay, how do I ask it? Okay, so you work sort of backwards like that, and that way you ensure that there's validity, i.e., that it is on the syllabus. Fundamentally, marking schemes are meant to increase the objectivity of the marking process. Okay, I was joking about machine marking. That would be extremely objective, but obviously something like that is not appropriate for many of the type of questions I've been discussing. So we need to have human beings who are objective and who are making the same decisions as the other human beings in the team. Okay, marking schemes help to ensure that knowledge and understanding is rewarded, but draft marking schemes certainly have to be flexible enough that if we need to, we can say, instead of saying 6 for this and 3 for that, we can make it 3 for the first part and 6 for the second if we need to get the statistics right, i.e. consistent with those of previous years. So what a marking scheme really is trying to do, I was at a conference last year and the presenter put up essentially this slide, and I thought it was a very good way of talking about what marking schemes do. Also, I'm contractually obliged to put up a Venn diagram at every presentation I do. It has to happen, and it always does happen. So this is the one for this talk. We are trying to reduce in a marking scheme the zone of uncertainty, i.e. is this right or is this wrong? Is that response right or wrong? And you might think, sure, something like some of my colleagues who manage subjects like English or history or whatever say, sure, in science and physics, it's either right or wrong, isn't it? So it must be very easy to mark. Unfortunately, it's not. Even if you're looking for, what color does a litmus turn in acid, and you say, well, the answer is red. Red is right, blue is wrong. Okay. The first candidate you look at says pink. Okay? Or they say pinkish red. Reddish pink. Whoa. So you got to start making some decisions, okay? Because what you can't have is that Paddy goes home and says pink is fine, okay? And Olive says, no, marking scheme says red, I'm not giving that. And then you have inconsistency. It doesn't really matter as long as we're all doing the same thing. It kind of matters as well, but we certainly want consistency. We want everyone doing the same thing. Now, an SEC marking scheme is therefore designed to help an examiner mark candidate work. It's designed to be used by an examiner who has been trained in its use. We have 2-day and 3-day marking conferences in Athlone every summer for people marking. And everyone is part of a team. Everyone has an advising examiner, and advising examiners have people that they can talk to so that we can get consistency in the marking, okay? An SEC marking scheme is not designed to be used by students or teachers. I'm not saying that they can't use them. I'm not saying that they shouldn't use them. I think they should, to be honest with you. But it's not designed for that purpose, okay? And it's not the same as a sample answer or a solution. Certainly in an exam like applied maths, the marking scheme is very much a skeleton. It's saying they get 5 if they get this far. It doesn't show them how to get there. It just says, this is what you need. So I would be very cautious about students using marking schemes by themselves. The best person to help them use a marking scheme is a teacher who has been marking themselves that summer. So that's why I'm saying you should all mark all the time. Now, so just for a few minutes, I just want to talk to you about some developments in senior cycle physics and give you some information about the state of play. And I think it's something that's important for everyone involved in physics education to know about. So the current physics syllabus, the sort of reddish document that I put up on the screen there a while ago, was introduced in schools in 2000 and first examined in 2002. Okay? There was a sample paper in February 2002, and then there was the real paper in June 2002. And then in 2006, I believe it was around November 2006, the NCCA began work and called together what they call a development group to begin work on developing a new syllabus or new specification for physics. And they kept doing something and kept doing something. I joined that development group in 2013 when I joined the SEC. And in 2013, I think things had kind of lapsed. They didn't, I mean, they had been working on this for a long, long time. Forget about the Children's Hospital. This was, you know. So they reconvened and someone lit a fire and we got something in 2014 and we had a draft specification. But embedded in the specifications for physics and chemistry and biology was the idea that there would be a practical exam. And the SEC would administer it by sending examiners out to schools and getting the examiners to watch the students do practical work. And that was, you know, a huge, huge change, something very, very new, obviously very exciting. But the SEC rightly said we need to trial this. We need to see, is it workable? Are there reasons why it's not workable? Are they things that we can overcome, or are they not? Okay, and so in 2017 we did our trial, and I'll talk to you about that in a second, and some of you were involved in that. Meanwhile, obviously the subject that sort of feeds into Leaving Cert Sciences is junior cycle science. The new specification for junior cycle, which was part of junior cycle reform, under which all subjects are undergoing reform. Science was the second subject, joint second after English, to be reformed, and the new specification was introduced to schools. As I said, we did our trial in 2017. The omens were against us. I'm not a religious person, but we did the trial in October, and my God, there was a storm. Ophelia was her name, and she was not nice, and it messed significantly with the trial. Okay, some of the people from Dungarvan are here. Your school was involved, wasn't it, Michael and Olive? And I don't think you were that badly affected by the storm. It seemed to go for Cork in a serious way. But we did the trial, and it was an immensely interesting learning experience. And we wrote a report, and if ever you're struggling to sleep, please download and read the report. But essentially the report said there are significant problems doing this, trying to engineer inter-candidate equity. Okay, and that's very, very important in a high-stakes exam like the Leaving Cert. And so, resulting from the report, the DES decided not to implement the draft specification and asked the NCCA to review the spec, and that's kind of where we're at now. Okay. Meanwhile, science had been progressing. We had the first exam for that in June 2019. And the new development group for physics has been convened, and some people, Grania, I was talking to, you're on that. There's a development group that essentially tries to take representatives from various organizations, including third level, but mostly from second level, to work on developing a physics specification. And concurrently, other development groups will be working on biology and chemistry. So that first meeting is on in a couple of weeks' time. And ambitiously, the plan is that this new specification will be ready in 12 months, in September 2020 or August 2020 or something like that. That's optimistic, I would say, but sometimes you only get things done if you have a sort of a deadline for having it done. The idea then that it would be introduced to schools in 2021, so people in 5th year, September 2021, with the idea of the first examination by 2023, okay? So I've put those up in red because that's not, I don't think, written in stone, but that is the plan. But as I say, this began in 2006. So 17 years later, we might have an exam. So I can say from an SEC's perspective, something that we're very interested in that exam being is a completion booklet. Because for online marking, it's much, much easier if you can scan a document and you know where their answer to question 7b will be. And you know where their answer to question 12a will be. Whereas in an unstructured booklet where you just give them blank paper, they can answer in any order and put things anywhere, and it means that the examiner has to scroll up and down trying to find an answer. Was anyone here involved in marking online this summer? Olive and Michael were. Does anyone else here mark maths or anything like that? I don't recognize any other science or examiners. Okay. But online marking certainly dictates that we should be looking at a completion booklet. Michael, I guess in biology you saw half and half, didn't you? You saw completion booklet and unstructured, yeah.
Exactly like you said, they're answering manual
yeah.
paper on paper.
And it's much, much easier to mark when it's yeah. So, obviously, what I just put up has some implications in terms of timelines. You know, is that going to be feasible? We said no to the practical exam, but there will be some sort of second component, meaning something that's not just a written paper in June. So it'll be some sort of coursework or project or something like that, and the details of that obviously will have to be ironed out as to how much it'll be worth and what it will look like. Will there be options in the syllabus, like there are at the moment in the physics syllabus, between the applied electricity and the particle physics? Will there be options? I'd say probably not, but that's for the development group to figure out. Will there be choice on the paper? Well, there are some people who say that whenever you have choice, you have unfairness, because now you don't have it that both candidates are doing the same paper. They're kind of choosing to do different papers. And whenever you have choice, then you also have the possibility of teachers or students saying, I leave out that because I have the choice. I leave out, you hear people, I mean, it's insane. You hear people saying, I'm leaving out electricity. Well, how can I, or I'm leaving out mechanics. You might as well leave out physics, okay? So if you've no choice, you eliminate the sort of, selecting parts of the syllabus that you like. There will be levels, yes, there will be higher level and ordinary level, that will continue. There's no talk of that changing. And then I think, as I was saying, it would be a completion book as opposed to a free response book because of online marking. And as I was saying, junior science, Leaving Cert Physics, Leaving Cert Chemistry, Leaving Cert Biology, and a number of other subjects were marked online in 2019, and in 2020 even more will come online, and over the next few years pretty much everything will. I imagine what many of you are thinking is, okay, if this new syllabus is coming into my school in 2021, am I going to get training on this? Am I going to get supports? And the department, I'm sure, will be looking at that if and when these syllabi are ready in terms of support services and those sorts of things. Whenever there's a new syllabus, the SEC will produce a sample paper, or in this case, sample papers for the 2 levels of physics. But we don't produce them until about maybe October, November, before the first exam. So that, I imagine, would continue. Now, I decided to end by putting up some numbers, okay? And these are the number of sits for Leaving Cert Physics, higher level in red, ordinary level in blue, and I've put them up for since 2001. That was the year of the new exam. So the first group to do the exam, having already seen the exam, was this, 2004. And, well, the numbers took a bit of a dip there for a few years. I'm not saying that that was the fault of the new syllabus that was introduced in 2000, examined for the first time in 2002, but that the numbers did go down. What we can also see is that almost every year the numbers doing ordinary level get smaller, and certainly the ratio higher to ordinary is changing with more doing higher. 2013 is when there was a new chief examiner, and again, you can see the effect of that, okay? It's just numbers, just statistics, okay? If you can't handle it, if you don't like it, then, no, that's correlation, not causation. That would be a good example of that, I guess, if we were teaching maths. Gender, I wanted to put up as well. So I went back to 2005 because comparing 2005 and 2019, it's approximately the same number doing it, about 8,000 in total between the 2 levels. In 2019, there's a lot more doing higher level than ordinary level than would have been the case in 2005. But if we look at gender in 2005, in the higher level, about 30% of the candidates were girls, and very small numbers at ordinary level, about 13% were girls. But in total, a 3-to-1 split, 25% female, 75% approximately male. And has it changed significantly? No, it hasn't. It's got ever so slightly better if you think women doing physics is a good thing, which I do, because this is being recorded. My wife is a physics teacher and is very passionate about that. So that's something that's real and no one has the solution to. Some of us were talking this morning, and our friend from Poland, sorry, I don't know your name, or friend with the camera, was telling us that in Eastern Europe, it's very much a female sort of, or it's much more equal, certainly. So that's something that everyone, I think, needs to consider. So thank you very much, and if you have any questions, you can email the generic info @ and someone will answer you at some point. So thank you very much.